Welcome to the Nexdigm podcast. My name is Sundar. I lead the forensic services at Nexdigm. This podcast is part of Global Anti-Corruption series. Our podcast is an endeavor to bring up emerging topics of relevance for executives across spectrum of services we offer. Hope you enjoy the podcast. Across the geographies, regulatory environments are changing, business practices are changing, and behaviors are changing with COVID. Anti-corruption in the current environment is bringing newer dimensions with issues around supply chain, healthcare, and other reporting requirements. This also extends to regulatory interventions and the whole new virtual world. In this podcast series, we'll be interviewing specialists across regions to gather specific insights on anti-corruption in current times. The region that would get covered today is US. In specific, we're going to be speaking more about government contract environment within the US. Today we have with us Alex. Alex is an experienced litigator. He is part of Chevalier. He has a wide range of experience in handling government contracts law. He's named as one of the top lawyers under 40 by Hispanic National Bar Association in 2020. He's here to share insights regarding the potential anti-corruption issues arising out of government contracts in the current times in US region. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Sundar. Very good to be here with you.
Fantastic. Alex, to just start with, in the government contracting kind of an area, do you see a change in perception of corruption risk in the current environment?
Yes, I mean, ordinarily the risks of corruption and fraud in the government procurement world are pretty well defined and manageable in a domestic context. The US government and most companies have pretty well established controls to identify areas of risk. And for the most part, they have the necessary tools to address those risks in an effective way. But obviously, we're not living in ordinary times. Because of COVID, the risks that we see are more varied, they arise more frequently, and they can be more challenging to detect and address. In many ways, this whole situation is very similar to other crisis situations where you have federal, state, local governments, and even private institutions spending pretty significant amounts of money, and they're spending that money very quickly for items necessary to respond to the domestic spread of COVID-19. So items like PPE, testing kits, testing services, hospital gowns, et cetera, the list goes on. And we know that when lots of money is spent very quickly, regardless of where you are in the world, for example, on disaster relief following a major hurricane, the risks for corruption and fraud are especially acute. So another lesson that we've learned from situations that are at least analogous to the situation we find ourselves in today is that while government enforcement of corruption and fraud issues may initially lag behind, it eventually catches up. So take, for example, the federal response to Hurricane Katrina here in the United States many years ago. The country, like it is right now, very quickly spent massive quantities of money on the recovery effort there. They were building infrastructure, providing medical care and other basic human services to the people who were affected by the storm. And while it took some time, eventually the DOJ and the US Congress and other federal entities got around to prosecuting instances of alleged corruption and fraud. So here in the United States, it's very common, for example, for the Department of Justice to set up corruption and anti-fraud task forces or committees. The same with Congress. They can set up special investigative committees to look into instances of corruption and fraud after the fact. And so with COVID-19, we fully expect the story will be no different, right? All indications are that we will see prosecutions and enforcement actions for many years to come. DOJ has in fact already established special COVID-19 task force that are focused very aggressively on prosecuting allegations of price gouging, hoarding, market manipulation, insider trading, in investor fraud. In the government contracts world, there will be, and we've already seen an uptick in cases brought by the Department of Justice and key TAM relators under the Civil and Criminal False Claims Act, which is going to be most likely a very often used enforcement tool by the United States to ferret out allegations of fraud as a result of COVID. So I fully expect that those types of prosecutions, those are going to long outlive the virus itself.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a very interesting analogy to put in. Whenever the government spend more money in too short a time, there's going to be expectations of higher corruption, and that corruption is going to come through. And I also like the another reference that you made specifically, where you said that while there's going to be enforcement, there may be a time lag in the time it is taken by the regulators to get the enforcement done, but that would happen. That would come. At any point of time, because it's government spending. Of course, the government will be extremely mindful of such spending, much more than what it would be in a private sector scenario. That's an interesting perspective. That's really helpful. I'm just wanting to extend it further. You gave the references that similar to previous crises that the country would have seen. There are a number of newer things that are evolving. Are you seeing COVID bringing in specific risks of anti-corruption in the current times? Is that something that you're seeing?
Yes, absolutely. So this pandemic, like the other disaster recovery scenarios that I alluded to before, results in a confluence of factors that really heighten the risk of corruption and fraud issues here in the United States, like anywhere else in the world. Again, because lots of money is being spent very quickly, many companies and even individuals, they rightfully perceive that there are potential business opportunities that may not have existed before the pandemic. But this can also have a number of unforeseen consequences, as we all know. So, for example, as a result of the pandemic, we have seen, at least in the interim, a pretty significant economic downturn, right? So when that happens, many companies naturally start to make attempts to diversify their business, and in many cases, they're operating outside their core areas of expertise. So, you may have a car manufacturer, and these are real life examples. You have a car manufacturer that's suddenly producing ventilators for hospitals. Well, obviously, that's not its core business, right? And these areas in which these companies are branching out to, they're often very heavily regulated. So, for example, by the FDA, or in my world, the federal procurement arena, where you have a number of rules and regulations that if you are not a government contractor under ordinary circumstances, you may be surprised at the extent to which the government regulates the award and performance of government contracts.
Absolutely. And do you think this also extends in terms of the number of touch points that people have with regard to government? For example, it not just extends from the regular touch point that somebody would have had with regard to their procurement transactions. Now, because they're entering into newer lines of businesses, there will be licensing requirements, there will be regulatory oversight requirements that would come in business environments which they were not exposed to otherwise, and with people who were not exposed to such business environments otherwise. So how do you see that coming along in the context of risks and COVID?
It's an excellent point, right? So naturally, as you move into new areas that require interaction with different pockets of the U.S. government, undoubtedly you are going to see new additional touch points that, as a company, you may not have the institutional knowledge or the institutional muscle memory to be able to navigate that in an expert way, right? And so one of the things that ends up happening here, again, because the pandemic is a crisis situation, and we like the government in the private sector are moving at the speed of light in order to support the response. You see a lot of companies becoming much more heavily dependent on third-party brokers and consultants who hold themselves out as understanding the process, for example, for obtaining a license from the FDA, or from an import-export perspective, representing to companies that, they've got the relationships and they know the people that they need to talk to within the United States. That obviously, creates a lot more risk, because when you are moving so quickly and when the transactions themselves are streamlined in many ways. The procurement process is streamlined in so many ways. You have less time to vet those third parties and those brokers and to really understand who you're doing business with. So, for example, in February and in March, there was a tremendous rush, both from the United States, but even in the European Union and other parts of the world, to secure PPE and ventilators, primarily from Southeast Asia, right? And now we, in retrospect, I mean, it feels like a lifetime ago, but it's only been a couple of months. We now know all of these well-known issues that you saw with canceled orders because there was a higher bidder who came behind you, or allegations of price gouging or counterfeit goods, et cetera, et cetera. And many of those mishaps are in fact traceable, or at least attributable in part to the fact that you had companies who were perhaps migrating into areas outside of their core expertise, but who necessarily became dependent on outside advisors or middlemen to be able to support their work in these new areas. And so when you do that, when you have this sort of perfect storm of factors, the risk for things like an expectation that a bribe or that a kickback will be paid, or a broker's fee that no one can really explain will be paid or will be accepted, the risks of that increase pretty significantly, right? Because the demand is very high, the supply is very constrained, and you are reliant on entities and individuals that you may not really have a great sense of who you're conducting business with.
Absolutely. One of the things that's very interesting that I wanted to take forward from the reflections that you gave is that while these environments are changing, these are all, like what you said, it is not too far ago that these events happened. These events are very fresh, about a couple of months old. That's about it. In these times, are you seeing with the lockdown, relaxation, or even remote working kind of environment, do you see this is creating newer avenues for corruption or newer challenges with regard to corruption, including the healthcare focus? That's something that I want to get a perspective.
Sure. It's interesting because I'm not sure that it's new in one sense, although the cause of the heightened risks may be slightly different than we're used to, right? But for the most part, the types of risks that we're talking about really are born out of some things that we see all the time, right? In normal times. So, for example, I think remote work and stay-at-home orders certainly can increase the risk of corruption and fraud in many different ways. So this is a particularly acute risk, I think, for small to medium-sized companies that are more reliant on manual controls and that don't have, for example, the technological capability to manage risk remotely, right? So if you are physically confined and you can't go, for example, to inspect the warehouse that is supposedly supplying the N95 masks that you are in turn supposed to supply to the Department of Human Health and Services, that creates incremental risk. It's not that it's impossible to properly vet that step or that link in your supply chain, but the fact that you have to do that remotely, even the best Skype or Zoom meeting is not going to give you a full view of the potential risks that may exist on the ground. And so while you have larger companies that have very, very extensive technological capabilities and the ability to vet remotely in a much more efficient and effective way, it's the small to medium-sized companies that I think as they venture into this world of providing PPE or procuring other types of goods and services to support the pandemic response, it's really those companies that need to double down on investing in their compliance program and figuring out ways to try to achieve the same result that you normally would in normal times, but perhaps using different controls or different approaches to achieve those same ends.
Yeah, that's very interesting. The way you said in terms of even if somebody wants to validate the quality of a PPE, that's going to happen through a video conferencing kind of a channel. So that's going to be difficult, right? Your visual inspection is so very limited with a computer vision, right? So With that, I know that there's going to be, you did allude to this particular point, that there's going to be several issues that will come up or already coming up with regard to government procurement transactions where there are bid rigging and other allegations that are coming along. How do you see the enforcement moving in this particular segment? Do you see the enforcements moving more aggressively even at the time of pandemic, or like what you mentioned earlier, you're expecting it to evolve over a period?
Yeah, I think this, like other types of disasters, will follow a very familiar pattern, right? So what you see now from the Department of Justice and state attorney generals primarily, but also offices of inspector general, what they're focusing first on, as they have in similar situations in the past, they focus first on the low-hanging fruit, as I'll call it, where they're prosecuting the most egregious examples of corruption and fraud. And we already see examples of that, both in connection, with the government procurement world, but other government programs here in the United States where large quantities of federal funds are flowing to private entities. So a perfect example of that is the Paycheck Protection Program. So it's a program that is administered by the Small Business Administration in conjunction with the U.S. Department of Treasury. And the idea there was, as part of our economic stimulus legislation in the United States, was to be able to grant very low interest forgivable loans to qualified or eligible small businesses so that they could use those loans to finance their operations during this economic downturn. The idea was to try to keep small businesses in Main Street operating when access to other sources of capital may be very constrained. Well, what we've already seen in the first several weeks of that is the Department of Justice has brought 8 cases in just 6 weeks where they are focused on miscertifications in loan applications, instances where, pretty egregious instances where shell companies were created solely for the purpose of obtaining the loan. Instances where the individuals who took out the loan or accepted the loan from the United States, rather than using the loan for eligible costs like running payroll for their employees or paying their rent or their utilities for their office space, they were using it on buying vehicles and entertainment and all those sorts of things. So in the first instance, I think, as is often the case, the Department of Justice here in the United States is focused initially on those egregious examples. And then inevitably, what happens here is sort of you start with the congressional inquiries, right, that are going to be focused on broader questions of fraud, waste, and abuse. Those inevitably will follow, and you'll see the parade of government personnel and business executives called to Capitol Hill, right, and they're going to account for the trillions of dollars in taxpayer funds that were spent to stabilize the economy and to help mitigate the impact of the virus. But that is sort of, traditionally has been the next step, and I fully expect that'll happen here. And then eventually, the trickier part that has the longest shelf life, if you will, is when both the Department of Justice and other enforcement entities really turn their attention to the more subtle instances of corruption and potential fraud, right? So it's the less obvious and maybe higher level activity that one might not initially think of. So in the case of COVID, it remains to be seen where the focus of enforcement resources is going to be applied. But as I said earlier, the early indications are here that the U.S. government is going to rely very heavily on the Civil and Criminal False Claims Act to ferret out, not only procurement fraud, but healthcare fraud. And then, there are also rumblings that DOJ is working very hard to look at things like insider trading and investor fraud, right? Who knew what, when, and how this pandemic was going to impact our economy and impact the valuation or shares of particular publicly traded companies, and how did they act on that? And that's, those are the types of prosecutions and enforcement actions that really do last several years, and they take quite a while to resolve. But that's the normal evolution that you normally see in these situations, and I think that will happen here as well.
Fantastic, and that actually gives a holistic perspective of things that can happen, not just from a government contracting perspective, even otherwise with regard to other events that are happening at the time of the pandemic that we are speaking. Just to extend further, now that we are at the end of our podcast, I just wanted to ask you this question: what are the two or three things that you want to suggest to compliance officers who are either working in or work driving compliance in companies which are currently working with government or are intending to involve themselves in government contracting? What are the things that you would suggest there?
Yeah. So if I was the CCO at my company, I would focus on a few key areas. So first, I would try to understand how my company's business has and is changing as a result of COVID-19, right? As we said, you've got companies that are moving outside their core areas of expertise. So the very first thing I think you need to do is to make sure that you understand how your business model is evolving as a result of the pandemic. So have there been changes in your customer base? Or the way that your customers are purchasing and paying for your goods and services? Is our business, operating in a regulated space now that creates new risks that we may not be familiar with? Have we been forced or put in a position where we're more heavily reliant on third parties and business partners to, determine if we can or should go forward with a particular transaction? So the very first thing I think is to understand how the business is changing and has changed as a result of the pandemic. So second, after taking stock of how the business has changed, I think I'd examine, how are your current internal controls and procedures configured, and how best do you determine if those existing controls, are adequate enough to manage the new risks that you're facing as a business, right? So if you identify the gaps, or if you identify gaps, for example, through internal auditing or other sorts of reviews of transactions, I think what I would recommend is that you take steps to develop modified controls, whether they're temporary or they are, longer lasting. The idea is to find where your existing policies and procedures may have blind spots, and then figure out how do you adapt or modify those or create new controls and procedures to make sure that you don't miss anything during this period. And then finally, it's sort of the good hygiene 101 here for any compliance officers. You place an emphasis on continuously evaluating what you missed, right? What are those blind spots that your internal auditing is identifying, and then how can you adapt your existing model to make sure that it doesn't happen again? So implementing a cycle of continuous testing and self-assessment really is the best way to limit your risks, and it's also the best way, by the way, to persuade the U.S. government if there's ever any question about any particular transaction or the way that you're operating as a business. It's really the best way to persuade the U.S. government that you are a responsible corporate actor, and that any issues are just simply something that was missed by accident, as opposed to done with malintent, if you will.
Absolutely, Alex. It looks like I have had a conversation with a chief compliance officer and not a lawyer. Yeah, it's interesting. That was a very interesting perspective, Alex. I think I really appreciated the way you had put across in terms of why continuing a certain procedures that you currently doing and then assessing your blind spots are critical in this current times. I think I really enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure the listeners will have a lot of insightful content coming out of this conversation. I really appreciate you joining this podcast. I look forward to connecting with you again soon. Thank you.
Same here. Thank you, Sundar.